Well, here we are in the final book of Jeremiah, chapter 52. If you've been following us, you realize that really the book of Jeremiah technically ended in chapter 51, but this is kind of a historical appendage that they added to the book of Jeremiah to just remind us of some of the history and things. So this is going to talk again about Jerusalem being besieged by the Chaldeans, by Babylonians, and being destroyed. So kind of going back to that destruction that happened basically. Now, Thompson said this concluding chapter to the book of Jeremiah is based on 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25, with the exception of a little piece in chapter 25, verse 22 to 26, which is the story of Gedaliah's assassination. We saw that in a previous chapter in Jeremiah already. Chapters 40 and 41, in fact, of Jeremiah. The section from Kings was probably included to show how Jeremiah's prophecies were fulfilled. He had reiterated many times that Jerusalem would be destroyed and Judah sent into exile, and things happened as he had foretold. The other aspect of Jeremiah's preaching was the promise of restoration. In the release of Jehoiachin, recorded in chapter 52, the first sign of hope for the future was given. So what Thompson's mentioning there is basically think of this chapter as the vindication of Jeremiah's prophecies. Jeremiah prophesied Babylon's going to destroy Jerusalem. The Jews are going to go into exile. They'll eventually come back. They will be restored back. And so chapter 52 is going to give us the historical context that proves that Jeremiah was right, basically. So let's get started in here. Verse 1, Zedekiah was 21 years old, so 21, when he began to reign. And he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. So now Zedekiah wasn't his real name. His real name was Mattaniah, basically. He was the uncle of the king Jehoiachin, who was the king at the time, basically. In fact, in verse 2, and he did that which was evil in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that Jehoiakim had done. I didn't finish verse 1. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. So Zedekiah followed Jehoiakim, basically. They were both more pro-Egyptian kings. They were very wicked. They encouraged idolatry. They weren't very good kings. They didn't have a good moral compass. They weren't really stoic kings. Kind of whatever's popular, whatever's cool. I want to be seen as the cool kid, the cool king, kind of things. So they fell into a lot of traps. So Jehoiakim was there when Babylon marched through, and he was killed, and then Babylon finished it off. Jehoiachin, his son, was the king as Babylon sieged Jerusalem the first time, and then took him off, and then put Zedekiah in. Zedekiah was the king of the second siege, the full destruction of Jerusalem, basically. So verse 3, for through the anger of the Lord it came to pass in Jerusalem and Judah, till he had cast them out from his presence, that Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And it came to pass in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, in the 10th day of the month, that Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, came, he and all his army, against Jerusalem, and pitched against it, and built forts against it round about. So this is verse 4, is the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. So Nebuchadnezzar comes down in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign. Zedekiah went 11 years. So there's the last 3 years of his reign was dealing with the siege of Babylon. Basically, the siege started around 588 BC time frame, 589 into 588 BC time frame. So it took a while for this to happen. About 18 months, in fact. We're going to see this. So verse 5, so the city was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And in the 4th month, in the 9th day of the month, the famine was sore in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. We've heard this, remember, when they brought Jeremiah out of the cistern, where the princes were hoping he would just die of natural causes so they wouldn't have to execute him. They were told to feed him, but the bread was running out, and they were struggling to feed each other. This is the siege. You block people off, you cut them off from their resources, let them starve to death, and then you take them over when they can't fight back. That's siege warfare. This is what's happening to them. So this is like so from the beginning of the siege to this point in verse 6, 18 months. So a year and a half, the siege was going on basically. Then in verse 7, then the city was broken up, and all the men of war fled and went forth out of the city by night by the way of the gate between the two walls, which was by the king's garden. Now the Chaldeans were by the city round about, and they went by the way of the plain. Now, if we think about this, this is around July of 587 BC. Okay, this is, again, 18-month siege. Now, this is really fascinating to think about. There's this secret passage in the king's garden between the two walls. If we were familiar with how the city was constructed back then, we might know where this is. But we don't fully understand where this is. It's probably a secret way the king could come and go from the city without going through the populous areas of the city, basically. Possibly to kind of take an advantage of the geography of the area so he could escape out and get away, basically, when enemies would come in. So people were fleeing that way. Now, verse 8, but the army of the Chaldeans pursued after the king. So the king fled. His servants are like, the king's leaving the secret way. We're going to follow him. The king is fleeing away from Jerusalem, and the Chaldeans realize there's the king. He's leaving. Go after him. So the Chaldeans, the Babylonian army, pursues Zedekiah as he's trying to flee. And they overtook Zedekiah in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. So the people around Zedekiah, you're on your own. Every man for themselves. Babylon's chasing us down, basically. You're about to get captured. We're not going down with the king. The king gets captured. Verse 9, they took the king and carried him up unto the king of Babylon to Riblah, in the land of Hamath, where he gave judgment upon him. So Riblah is an ancient Syrian town south of Kadesh on the Orontes River. It was the meeting point of several military roads between Egypt and Mesopotamia, so a strategic base for Nebuchadnezzar to set up. He was actually fighting Egypt at the time as well. That's part of the reason the siege took so long. Is remember, they sieged Jerusalem, then Egypt came in to fight, and so they had to kind of pull their armies away from Jerusalem to go after Babylon or go after Egypt. And so that was that time of the dialogue when Jeremiah was being thrown into the cistern and brought back out, and he bought the land in the north from his cousin, basically. And then once Egypt retreated, then Babylon came back to finish the siege and take them out, basically. And there was, I think, some other battles up north that Babylon was fighting as well, Syria and other things. So Nebuchadnezzar's not in Babylon. His generals are running that campaign. He's up in Riblah. So they capture Zedekiah, they take him to Riblah, and they pass judgment on him, basically. Now, verse 10, it says, and the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes. Took them all out, basically. So Zedekiah had to watch his family be killed. We learned about this more in a previous chapter. It's sad to watch your own family die, but it's because basically you are going to have no more children, no more future descendants. Your line is done. Your line is leaving the earth, basically. And then he slew all the princes of Judah at Riblah after he took out Zedekiah's eyes. So the last thing Zedekiah saw with his eyes is his family being murdered by the Babylonians, and then his eyes are gouged out. So that's the last image he has in his mind, is his family being killed. And then he's shipped off to Babylon to be a prisoner. Then all the princes of Judah were killed at Riblah as well. Now verse 11, now he put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and the king of Babylon bound him in chains and carried him to Babylon, put him in prison till the day of his death. Now there is a legend, and we talked about this in the previous chapters as well, of one of Zedekiah's sons, Mulek, who was smuggled out of Jerusalem at this time. He fled Jerusalem. Some of the high priests in the temple realized what was going on. They were rounding up and capturing the king's family, so they got Mulek out of there. There is some record of this mention of this happening. It might have been a story of them getting help from Phoenicians because they they got out of there. They probably sailed away. So Phoenicians were good at sailing. They probably went to the far end of the Mediterranean. Um, but we don't know what happened to them. According to the biblical history and ancient documents in the Middle East, basically, the Book of Mormon does pick up with the story of Mulek fleeing, and they eventually made it to the Americas, where they ran into the Lamanites and Nephites and other people that were there, Jaredites and them, and then learned about them that way, basically. So they kind of connect back in the Americas decades later. So we'll go over that story more as we get into the Book of Mormon. We talk about it at the time in the previous chapters of Jeremiah as well. So verse 12, now in the 5th month, in the 10th day of the month, which was the 19th year of Nebuchadrezzar's king of Babylon, came Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, which served the king of Babylon, into Jerusalem. So this is probably the Nebuzaradan, excuse me, crazy names. He's probably the general that was running the campaign against Jerusalem. He goes into Jerusalem, basically, and he's in there. Okay, so Zedekiah is gone. He's in Babylon. We don't know how long he lived, but he lived out the rest of his days in Babylon. So now the general is inside Jerusalem. Verse 13. So this is like 587 BC, basically. Verse 13, and burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the house of Jerusalem and all the house of the great men, burnt he with fire, basically, destroyed the place. So he was there to oversee, make sure Jerusalem was destroyed. So he came into the area, probably was one of the leaders of the campaigns. After the armies did their job, then he came in to make sure everything was wiped out, basically. Verse 14, and all the army of the Chaldeans that were with the captain of the guard break down all the walls of Jerusalem round about. So there is a lot of archaeological evidence showing this. Okay, the entire wall was brought down, basically. So this did two things. When you destroy the wall around a city, the city loses its major defense. Wild animals will come into the city to kill people and steal off your animals and things. Thieves could get in the city. Invading armies could just wipe you out at any time because you had no city wall for your defense. So this left Jerusalem completely defenseless, basically. And there were raids of other neighboring countries coming in to take advantage of the destruction of Jerusalem to gather what valuables they could and get back out of Jerusalem. So verse 15, then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive certain of the poor of the people, and the residue of the people that remained in the city, and those that fell away, that fell to the king of Babylon, and the rest of the multitude. Now, here's what's interesting. There were certain of the poor. So this isn't the abject poor, like the people who are sick and homeless. These are the people that have some skills. They would take the people who could be good laborers or good craftsmen, and they moved them to Babylon to benefit Babylon's economy. So if you had marketable skills, you were taken to Babylon. If you had no marketable skills, you were left, basically, and good luck surviving. So that's what it is. These are the people who could provide cheap labor or slave servitude in Babylon. These were the artisans, the craftsmen who could do great work in Babylon and help that economy out in Babylon. So that was this part of that spoils of war, basically, and the rest were all left. So if your whole job was picking fruit on the farm and that's all you didn't go to Babylon. They didn't need you. They needed other people that were more skilled than you. Or even if you were a healthy person, if you did well at the labor, then they'd probably hire you to be a slave and pick their Babylonians' crops for them, basically. Cheap labor. But that's what they did, is they gathered these people up, not everybody, but a lot of these people up that showed value to Babylon, and then they took them to Babylon. Now verse 16, but Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left certain of the poor of the land for vine dressers and for husbandmen. So again, these are the people who have no real skills. If you have good skills, you go to Babylon. If you don't, you're left. These are the ones that they just go pick the grapes all day long. I mean, it's manual labor. It's nothing hard about it. The unskilled groups, they got left behind, basically. to fend for themselves and have to eke out a living with no city wall, no protection, no defense, no armies, no government, nothing. Basically, they had to figure it out on their own. Verse 17, also the pillars of brass that were in the house of the Lord, and the bases and the brazen sea, that's the laver, that was in the house of the Lord, the Chaldeans brake and carried all the brass of them to Babylon. So if you remember, when the temple was built, this is the destruction of Solomon's temple. This is the end of the first temple period. That's what we're talking about here. So Solomon's temple had jewels and gold and brass and overlays and all these amazing things in their honor to their God, the Jehovah, Yahweh, basically. So Babylon strips all the value, all this metal off of it to take back to Babylon to use it for their own purposes. Now, verse 18, the cauldrons also, and the shovels, and the snuffers, and the bowls, and the spoons, and all the vessels of brass, wherein they ministered, took they away. So now, items in verse 17 are referred to actually in 1 Kings. We can see that in the historical record. The pillars are their name, Jachin and Boaz, and details of their ornaments are given in 1 Kings. The sea is mentioned in 1 Kings. That's the laver, the place where the priest would be ritually washed and anointed, preparatory to officiating in the more priestly things in the tabernacle and the temple. Basically, these are so all the wheeled trolleys, the candlesticks, the bowls for incense and oils and all this stuff. The goblets where you'd have the put the blood and things, and all the wealth of the temple is being taken to Babylon as treasure, basically. That's all that's going. Basically, they're gone. So there's a lot. There's a lot that's happening here. The bronze sea was about 15 feet in diameter, 7.5 feet high, all in cast bronze, 3 inches thick. So 3 inches of bronze in this huge 7.5 foot tall giant tub where they could put water in it and then do ritual washings and anointings and things. These pillars are 27 feet high, thickness of about 4 fingers. The wheel stands and their lavers were large enough to contain 20 baths of water each. Total quantity of bronze in each of these large items was enormous and clearly valuable enough to be transported to Babylon. We are in a good position today to understand the appearance of some of these items because of modern excavation. A model of a wheeled stand and base was discovered at Megiddo. Several finds throw light on the nature of some of the smaller items. The items on this list present some problems of interpretation, like the pots may have been used for removing fat and ashes from the altar. The shovels were probably used to remove ashes from the altar and place them in pots. The snuffers were used to trim the wicks of the lamps. The basins were bowls used to dash the blood of sacrifices against the altar, to judge from the verb to throw the blood, basically. Now, the incense bowls or ladles were probably vessels shaped in the form of a human palm. Small vessels with hands carved on their backs have been found in excavations in strata from the period of 1000 to 600 BC. Some of these show traces of carbon on the hollow side and may have been used for burning incense. All these vessels were very much smaller than the items of verse 18, but being bronze, they too could be melted down and the bronze reused. So they're talking about some of the big items and the small items are all taken. Anything metal, anything of value, they could take it to Babylon, melt it down, and make their own stuff out of them, basically. And verse 19, continuing on, the basins, the fire pans, the bowls, the cauldrons, the candlesticks, the spoons, the cups, that which was of gold in gold, that which was of silver in silver, took the captain of the guard away. So all this is gone, basically. These are taken out. And if we want to see more about what these were, you could look in go back to like Exodus and in the Leviticus and these places when the law of Moses was put in place and they built the original tabernacle. And these were very similar things that they ended up putting in the Solomon's temple as well. So really wealthy stuff. Now, verse 20, the 2 pillars, the 1 sea, the 12 brazen bowls that were under the bases, which King Solomon had made in the house of the Lord, the brass of all these vessels was without weight. Now, this is really interesting. Think of the bronze bowls. Bronze bowls had been removed in Assyrian times a century earlier and sent to the Syrian king Tiglath-Pileser. However, it is likely that the bulls were replaced since they were a regular part of the temple equipment, and in any case, the sea had to be supported on some kind of stand. The point is made that the bronze in all these things was beyond weighing. Clearly, the amount of the bronze in the temple was great. So big, there was so much weight. They're like, no, we can't weigh all this. We don't know the weight of this. We can't make a scale big enough to weigh how much bronze and silver and gold and metal that Babylon is taking, basically. Now, verse 21, and concerning the pillars, the height of one pillar was 18 cubits. A fillet of 12 cubits did compass it, and thickness thereof was about 4 fingers. So it was a hollow pillar, but big, tall pillar. Verse 22, and a chapiter of brass was upon it, and the height of one chapiter was 5 cubits, which is basically, according to 1 Kings, these pillars were cast by artisans in Hiram from Tyre in clay of the Jordan Valley. The method was similar to one used by the Assyrians for massive casting. The thickness of the metal in the hollow pillars was 4 fingers, that is 1/4 of a hand breadth, rather less than 1 inch. That's Thompson was putting this in his book as well. Now he says, with network on pomegranates upon the chapiters, round about all of brass. So this is super ornate stuff, common for what they had, these decorations of pomegranates and things up there. But not. This isn't just like, oh, this is a flat, straight pillar. It's ornamental. The second pillar also, and the pomegranates were like unto these. Now there were 96 pomegranates on a side, and all pomegranates upon the network were 100 round about. So lots of decorative work. Verse 24, and the captain of the guard took Seraiah, the chief priest, and Zephaniah, the second priest, and 3 keepers of the door. Now this is interesting. Let's pause for a second here. There's another one of those little paragraph symbols at the beginning of 24. The next verses give us a list of those who were taken to exile. So we're not talking about the stuff Babylon took. We're now switching to the list of the people Babylon took. Basically, and remember, Seraiah was the chief priest. He's the grandson of Hilkiah, who was Josiah's chief priest when Josiah put his reforms in place earlier, basically. So he went, the chief priest went. Zephaniah is possibly the person referred to in chapter 29. And in chapter 37, he would be the son of Messiah and one of the priests. He was sent to ask Jeremiah to pray for the people. If you remember, he was sent by Zedekiah to have him pray for the people, basically. Now, the keepers of the threshold were high-ranking priests, perhaps the custodians of the temple. They were all taken. Verse 25, he took also out of the city an eunuch, which had the charge of the men of war, and 7 men of them that were near the king's person, which were found in the city, and the principal scribe of the host, who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land that were found in the midst of the city. So these people here, this is a eunuch. This is an official who was in charge of the warriors, may have been of a civilian official whose duty was to act as overseer of the men of war, probably as a minister of defense type of idea. They called him eunuch. Now, there's a good chance he wasn't a eunuch, meaning a eunuch is a man who they have basically castrated. So he has no testicles anymore. So he can't get anybody pregnant. Oftentimes, eunuchs were used to oversee the women so that they couldn't have an affair with one of the king's women and have an illegitimate child. But it kind of turned into the idea of eunuchs were another name for servant. And I think that's what we're seeing in verse 25 here. Is this is a servant who was in charge of the men of war, so kind of a ministry of defense, basically. Now, then it talks about 7 men. They were near the king's person. So the group of 7 personal advisors were men who had access to the king's presence and were in his confidence, which means it says here they were near the king's person. Basically, they could see his face, they could talk with him. So these are the king's advisors. Then we talk about the principal scribe of the host. This is the assistant to the army commander who is responsible for personnel. So he was writing all the information down and understanding what was happening in the kingdom. And then there's the 60 men of the people of the land. So The 60 ordinary citizens may have been representatives of the general populace singled out from the conscribed soldiers for exemplary punishment. So these are all the people that were taken. Now, verse 26, so Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon to Riblah. And the king of Babylon smote them and put them to death in Riblah at the hand of Hamath, in the land of Hamath. Thus Judah was carried away captive out of his own land. So the people that we just talked about, they were rounded up. So these are the high priests, the other lesser priests, the advisors to the king, the royalty, the people in the royal house. They were all rounded up, taken to Riblah, and they were all executed. So the advisors, all the people that were dealing with the king at the time, all executed and gone. Basically, he just took out the government completely of Jerusalem. Now, verse 28, this is the people whom Nebuchadnezzar carried away captive. In the 7th year, 3,000 Jews and 3 and 20. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar, he carried away captive from Jerusalem 832 persons. So this is we're talking about several exiles here, okay? So verse 28, the first exile was 597 BC. This happened when Zedekiah was brought in as king. They took 3,000 Jews, over 3,000 Jews away. In the 18th year of the Nebuchadnezzar the king, so 11 years later, he carried 832 persons out. So this is the main exile that we hear of in 587 BC. Not as many people were taken out, but there's a ton of people that were killed, basically. So that's all. They didn't take a ton. In verse 30 it says, in the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away captive of the Jews 745 persons. All the persons were 4,600. So this is the third exile, which happened just before Gedaliah, the governor, was assassinated. So probably 582 BC. Basically, that they came back. Gedaliah was the governor. There was a revolt. Jerusalem, Babylon sent more people back, took more people, carried a captive to Babylon. Gedaliah was assassinated because they thought he was a puppet of Babylon. And then all chaos came out, and then everybody fled to Egypt because they're worried Babylon's come down again on them. That was just a couple of chapters ago. We went into that detail. So this might only count males as well. This is the thing to think about. When it talks about the persons were 4,600, most of the time when they did their counting back then, they only counted men. And more so adult men, so like around 18 years and up would be counted. So if you add, there's probably that many women and possibly that many or more children that were carried captive as well. This is a much bigger group of people. So it could be more closer to like 20,000 people were taken captive to Babylon from Jerusalem over the course of these 3 major exiles. Now you might say, wait, Curtis, I only remember hearing of 1 exile. That is true. If you go through Jeremiah, there are actually 3 exiles. So the middle one is the one we hear about. We don't hear about the first one very often. We don't hear about the third one hardly at all. But there were actually 3 exiles. We only mainly hear about the middle one when Jerusalem is destroyed, basically. This doesn't mean that 20,000 people made it to Babylon, because there were probably quite a few people who died on the journey. This is like an 800-mile journey, I think, if I remember right, from Jerusalem to Babylonia. So they had to travel and walk the whole way through desert. And there probably a lot of people died in that, old people, sick people, young people who couldn't survive it. They probably, a lot of died. Verse 31, and it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, so 37 years in the 12th month, in the 25th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the 1st year of his reign, lifted up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, and brought him forth out of prison. So this is, now if you remember in the beginning of verse 31, there's that little paragraph symbol again. That means that's the beginning of a new chapter in the ancient writings. So our chapters don't match up with the ancient writing chapters. So that's what we're seeing in here, basically. This is around 7 and 30th year, the captivity of Jehoiachin. So this is about 561 BC. Okay. Now, by this time, Nebuchadnezzar had died. His son, Evil Merodach, was king. His Akkadian name was Awel or Amel, Marduk, man of Marduk. Remember, Marduk is the god of Babylon. It is possible that the name in Hebrew is due not merely to the problems of transliteration between the two languages, but to deliberate corruption, since Ewil means a stupid person. So it's not evil Murdoch, but Ewil Murdoch. So a stupid person of Murdoch. Maybe they're trying to make fun of him. This man ruled for only a short time, 561 to 560 BC, before being assassinated by his brother-in-law, Nerigilisar. The present text suggests that Awel Merodach released Jehoiachin in his succession year, which is entirely possible since it was an occasion for acts of favor. It was also an occasion for vassals to renew their allegiance to the new king, and Jehoiachin may have done this. By then, it was some 35 years since his exile from Judah in 597 BC, so that an affirmation of allegiance would mean little. So Judah's destroyed, but he's given the signal to let the king out, because all the other ones, Zedekiah is dead, all the other ones are dead. Jehoiachin, who is the king that Babylon took off the throne, is still alive. He's the one that keeps that line of David alive that Matthew uses to prove that Jesus Christ is a direct royal son of David, basically. And that's in the New Testament. So things had changed greatly in Judah. He may, of course, still have been regarded by some in Judah as a legitimate ruler. Now, we saw that before, where people, after that first exile, a lot of people were believing that the rightful king would come back. Zedekiah was the false king. The rightful king would come back and to be in Judah again. Certainly in the early days of his exile, this was so, and it was popularly believed that Jehoiachin and the exiles would soon return. He was known as King of Judah in Babylon, to judge from receipts for oil, etc., issued in the name of Yaokin, King Judah, and his sons, found in excavations in Babylon. The character of his imprisonment is not known. He may have been well treated. So that was Thompson, his book of Jeremiah, gave us that little bit of background. So evil Merodach brings Jehoiachin out, brought him forth. In verse 32, and spake kindly unto him, and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon. So all the other kings, they kind of elevated Jehoiachin to be above those ones. And verse 33, and changed his prison garments, and he did continually eat bread before him all the days of his life. So he got treated better. They took care of him. They didn't treat him like a prisoner, but a head of state, basically. They brought him up as a head of state. He's integrated into society. He's allowed to do things. It's pretty amazing. Now, verse 34, continuing on, and for his diet there was a continual diet given him of the king of Babylon, every day a portion until the day of his death, all the days of his life. So it's interesting. They brought Jehoiachin, the leftover king of Judah, the only one that has a birthright to the throne, and rather than kill him, which was common, they did that to Zedekiah's descendants, his children. Evil Merodach makes him a head of state, brings him up and treats him like royalty, like a head of state with everybody else. And if you think about it, it's kind of like they are Babylonifying him. They're getting him to endear to Babylon. Maybe this is a signal to the Judah, to the people, the Jews that were in Babylon, to not revolt, not have problems, because we're elevating your king. You have status here. Let's help you to see us as the cool place to be. Don't fight against us. We're here, basically. So in a way, we could see this as a ploy to convince Judah to integrate into society in Babylon more. So that's the book of Jeremiah. Thank you for watching these videos. Again, if you're not looking, if you're like, man, I wish I could get these quotes that he's reading in these videos, I put them in the notes. In the description of the video, if you look below this video on YouTube, you click on the description, it'll show all these notes. Now, if the notes fill up too much space, because there's only a limited amount of space YouTube gives us. We put those notes in a blog post, and we put the link in the notes. So you can go get all these quotes. You can copy and paste them out and put them in your own scriptures or use them yourself. So we've made that easy for you to study and learn and have this wisdom with you in your own scriptures as well. Now let's jump to the next book in the scriptures, which is another book. This is the book that was written by Jeremiah. So let's jump over and see the Lamentations book.